Maybe they should make it a national holiday.
I'm gonna be honest, I don't know what Eid is, but a holiday sounds nice.
On Ramadan you fast during the day, and it's a period of like what, 2 weeks, 3 weeks?
A whole month.
A whole month. And Eid is the end of the fast.
Oh, that makes sense.
Like, if I was in Kurdistan, then we would like go to each neighbor's door and we'd be like, they gave like talk to them and they give us money and candy and all that.
Cool. All right. So, on to the lecture. America's Gilded Age, the period from 1870 to 1890. Now your book, the way your book is organized, it has what we're going to talk about next week, this week, and what we talk about the week after that. Hey, how's it going?
I couldn't find it anywhere.
But we never moved. So anyway, I just kind of reversed it because I like presenting the chapters this way more. And remember, once again, we have the study aids. If you print out the chapter outlines, it might help you out. It's my phone. Okay. So where did we get the word for the Gilded Age? Basically, we got it from a novel by Mark Twain, who talked about the shimmering golden gleam of the surface that covered the cheap nature of the base material underneath. The novel's main theme was that the post-Civil War years were an age of corruption, profiteering, and false glitter. Everybody got it? Now, what were some symbols of America during this age? We have one that was kind of America's ideal, and the other is much more America's actual. Now, the ideal, of course, is liberty enlightening the world, or as we better know it, the Statue of Liberty. Basically, it's a national symbol of freedom here in America. It was a gift to us from France because one night at a dinner in Paris, they were talking about, hey, how can we celebrate the 100-year anniversary of the Franco-American friendship? And Gustave Eiffel said, I know, let's build this huge statue. Now, guys, what else did Gustave Eiffel build that's still around today? Anybody know? Nobody here's ever heard of La Tour Eiffel? The Eiffel Tower? Ah! And it's funny, if ever you go to Paris, there's like, when you go to the Eiffel Tower, there's the working model for the statue that's like about 16 feet high. So it's like a mini-me. Anyway, they sent it over here in parts, and it was completely put together and everything on October 28th, 1886. Everybody got it? Now a little bit about the statue. It's got 7 spikes in its crown. What do those represent? Well, either the 7 seas or the 7 continents. The toga she's wearing represents Rome. The torch she's holding aloft represents enlightenment. The chains that are under her feet represent liberty, crushing slavery. And of course, on her tablet that she holds in her hand is our birthday, July 4th, 1776. Now, the government wanted America to have a part in erecting the statue, so what they did is they let American citizens pay for the base that the statue is on. And they sent out kids with a poem called The New Colossus, written by Emma Lazarus. And here, the kind of the last little stanza says what the ideal about America is. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. The wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. That's kind of like the ideal that we like to live up to and we like to think of ourselves as. Everybody got it? Then we have the actual, the Brooklyn Bridge. Basically, Brooklyn was a rapidly growing city, and if it wanted to maintain how quickly it was growing, it had to find a dependable way to connect Brooklyn to the island of Manhattan. So John Roebling designed the world's largest suspension bridge. And they went ahead and they decided to start building it. Now, John Roebling died shortly after this project was approved, so his son Washington had to take over, and they started on the 2nd of January, 1870, and this was a project that was totally run amok with disasters and difficulties. I mean, you had like their wire rope that they had bought was substandard, and a lot of it cracked and popped. They had these caissons because they had to dig all the way down to the bedrock for both of these towers. On this side, it was like 78 feet. On the other side, it's 90 feet. So they got these huge kind of tubs that they called caissons that were watertight and everything. They had weights on them, and basically they put them in the water and lowered them down until they hit the bed of the river. And so you had in this little space about this big, you know, guys that were digging out the dirt lit up by kerosene lamps. And one of these times the kerosene lamp was smashed and a fire was started, so everybody had to run up the tube on the rope ladder to get out. John Roebling was one of them, and he got Caisson's disease, which is known today as the bends. Now, does anybody here know what the bends are? What are the bends?
It's like, well, I know from scuba diving.
Yeah, it's scuba diving.
Whenever you go up too fast and the air like expands in your lungs, or?
Yeah, because the gases, the air, oxygen, nitrogen, everything is under pressure just like everything else when you're underwater. And if you don't stop every like 30 feet and for just like 10 seconds, but let your body regulate the expansion of the gases, you're going to clog up your circulatory system and your body's going to contort. Now today, if that happens, they basically throw you into a decompression chamber and hook up the pressure to where it was and then slowly release it. But they didn't have that back then, so he's like immobilized. You had more than 20 to 30 deaths on this project, including 4 guys that were like day laborers. So we have absolutely no idea who they were because they just showed up to get their pay for that day and do the work, and we don't know. Anyway, despite all the difficulties, it was finally completed on May 24th, 1883. The cost, the toll to get across the bridge was 1 cent if you were walking, 3 cents if you were taking a wagon. And on the first day it was open, 150,300 people walked across it. Brooklyn continued to grow, and it's still around today. Ready for the next one? Huzzah! All right, the second industrial revolution. Guys, all the sacrifices that America had been putting in since, the 1810s, the implementation of the American system to get our industry to grow, are going to erupt from 1869 to 1899. I mean, America is exploding. Our population triples. Our farm production more than doubles. The value of our manufacturing goods grows more than 6 times. During this time, we change from a rural society where people live in the countryside to an urban one where we're living in cities. And the rise of the cities is incredibly important to our rapid industrialization. So you can have workers. And now more and more people are buying stuff they used to make by themselves. Indeed, in 1880, the U.S. Census marks a shift in that for the first time, we have more Americans making their money from non-farming jobs. And by 1913, America is making 1/3 of all manufactured goods. So we were China before there was China. No. Ready? Now, one of the things that also greatly supported our industry was the railroads. Now, this was America's first big business. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean that it required a large-scale management and bureaucracy to support it. Because you had to have managers at the stations making sure all the goods were getting in on time, that they went where they were supposed to go. You had to have mechanics there to fix the trains. You had to have linemen to check the lines, as well as to expand to new lines. And just as they were responsible for taking coal and steel to the factories, they were big-time consumers of those exact same goods. Now, why are the railroads making such leap forwards now when we talked about they really had a difficulty getting off the ground here in America until like the 1850s? Well, a lot of the reason for that is the first transcontinental railroad here in America. Now, it didn't connect the East Coast and the West Coast. Rather, it connected Chicago to Mobile, the North and the South. That was worked out by Stephen Douglas. Y'all remember him? He's the guy that ran against Lincoln. And we'll talk a little bit more about what he did that was so crucial on the next slide. But as you can see, in 1862, we only had 30,600 miles of track. By 1880, it's up to 94,000 miles of track. By 1890, it's 167,000 miles of track. And by 1900, we've almost got 200,000 miles of track here in America. Why now are trains going so wacky? Because, guys, they're getting government money. Stephen Douglas was the first guy that got this. Basically, the government is subsidizing the growth of the railroads. They're giving them land, they're giving them low-interest loans. And this just isn't the national government, but also the state and local governments. Now, why would the government do that? Because that's taking our money to do that. How's that going to help us?
Wealth generates wealth.
Wealth generates wealth, kind of. What do you mean?
Like you put money in, you'll get more money out of it.
You want to know what is an excellent example of that?
The State Farm Building.
State Farm Building, or what about the North American headquarters of Toyota here in Plano, where Plano gave them $7 million. They don't have to pay taxes for 7 years. Plano is going to said, hey, we're going to connect you by rail, by road, anything it takes. How does that help out the average? And that's not even counting what the state of Texas gave Toyota. So how is that helping the Planesians?
Because those people are going to spend money in Plano or in the state.
Say what?
They're going to spend money in the like area.
But they're not collecting taxes from Toyota.
They're going to spend money.
Cost of what people are buying.
Maybe they're not collecting taxes from Toyota, but you work for Toyota. They'll tax you. Thank you. They'll tax you. Oh, by the way, you're going to need a place to live. Did you know that when Toyota moved here, the value of housing jumped up 30%? So you're going to need an apartment. You're going to need to move somewhere. Not only that, you're going to need to buy gas, maybe at her convenience store to fill up your car. You're going to want to go to a grocery store to get your groceries. Maybe go to a restaurant for fun. All of this stuff. And because more people are getting gas, getting groceries, going to restaurants, y'all are gonna need more employees too. And not only that, but Toyota doesn't make everything. They've got companies that work with Toyota. All those companies come here. You can see them all built up all along Parker in those big, huge buildings. And they don't get any tax breaks. And their employees have to pay taxes. So as you were saying, wealth creates wealth, opportunity creates opportunity. Oh, and just an example of that, 2 cities here in Texas. One was named Jefferson, the other one was another one. Anyway, Jefferson for a while was the 3rd largest town in Texas. Basically, it was up on the Red River. There had been something called the Great Raft, which was like a natural dam that slowed the flow of the Red River, so it was quite deep. So there was a lot of river trade going on there, and Jefferson was the star city. Like I told you, number 3 in population here in Texas. And the railroad was coming through, and the railroad said, "What are you going to give us?" And Jefferson said, "Excuse me, what are you going to give us?" And the railroad said, "Yeah, thanks, no thanks." But there was this scrappy little town by the banks of a muddy river that they thought they could get traffic on it all the way out to the Gulf of Mexico. They never were able to do that. But some of the forward-thinking guys in that city said, "Hey, we'll give you land right next to downtown, and we'll give you a loan." Now, do y'all know what Jefferson is known for today? Come and see what Texas was like in the 1890s. Because the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, they destroyed the Great Raft. Water levels went down. And because of the railroad, river traffic and trade died. Meanwhile, that other little burg, I'm trying to think of, it was named either after the vice president or someone in the Navy. Oh yeah, Dallas. Y'all ever heard of that place? Now, technological advances. Guys, the patent office in the decade of the 1790s registered 276 patents. In the decade of the 1890s, they registered more than 235,000 patents. Why are they doing this? Because you have the growth of new industries and the transformation of old ones with new processes like steel making, refining, refrigerator cars, the railroad, air brakes, barbed wire, cigarette rolling machines. 1867, you have the typewriter. 1869, the vacuum cleaner. And by the end of that century, you have the motion picture. You have internal combustion engines. Ready for the next slide? Now, 2 of the inventors. The first one is Alexander Graham Bell. He was born in Edinburgh, Scotland, came over here. The whole reason why we have the telephone is because he had a deaf sister. And more than anything, he wanted her to be able to hear. That's why if any of y'all know anybody who has deaf children or might be deaf, make sure they get a scholarship from AT&T, because they are still incredibly gracious to that community. In 1872, he was able to invent a microphone, but he's more famous for his 1876 development of an electrical speech machine, or the telephone. Basically, supposedly, they had a receiver on one end and a speaker on the other end. Alexander Graham Bell was on one end of the warehouse. Watson was on the other. He knocks over some acid. He said, "Watson, come here, I need you." And he heard it on the other side. Oh my gosh. Well, as soon as they announced that they had developed this, Western Union, who was scared to death of it, they had the telegraph. They basically locked him up in patent fights. And you know, why would the telegraph be so afraid of a telephone?
Isn't that useless?
Huh?
Isn't that useless?
Well, not useless, but
More competition.
well, it's fierce. Who's going to want to text when you can use the phone? Oh, wait a minute. Never mind. See what I did there about texting you kids? By 1885, they won the patent battle, and they formed American Telephone and Telegraph. Within 4 years, by 1889, they're a huge company with 49 subsidiaries themselves, also operating long-distance lines. Then you have Thomas Alva Edison, who was kind of like Bill Gates. He brought business to invention. He started his life selling candies on trains. Then he started looking at the telegraph, trying to make little improvements on what was around. He invented the phonograph in 1877, but he invented the incandescent light bulb in 1879, which could light, and you didn't have the danger of fire like you had with kerosene or gas. Also, it was odorless, and it sold like hotcakes. Well, now he had this thing that used electricity that everybody was buying. He needed to make more stuff that used electricity. So he started Edison Labs, which would kind of be like Microsoft, where they invented the storage battery, the dictaphone, the mimeograph, the electric dynamo, motion picture camera that was electrical as well as a projector. Indeed, he had a studio called the Black Maria that was like one of those huge trailers that goes on the back of a semi, that on one end it had the movie camera that took the movie. They'd take the film, they'd rush it over, process it, then they'd rush it to the other end, they'd edit it together, and then on the other side of the trailer, they'd be able to have a projector there. So within a few hours, they could show the people, hey, this is the film. Well, he hired a young immigrant by the name of Nikola Tesla. This guy was a genius with electricity. And indeed, some of this stuff people haven't been able to figure out still. I mean, this guy was just radically ahead of his time. And Edison, basically the way he transmitted his energy was DC, or direct current, which is a fine way to transmit electricity, but it's not very efficient and it loses power the further away you get from the generating source. Tesla, however, came up with AC, or alternating current. That didn't lose its power as it traveled. It could travel much further. Well, this was a huge threat. AC was a huge threat to Edison, because all of this stuff that he was building, he'd made with direct current. Direct current and alternating current do not get together at all, and they fry the motors out. That's why if ever you've gone to Europe, don't take your own electrical devices like hair dryers or razors. Leave them here, because unless you've got a converter for it, it'll fry it. Same thing for don't buy an electrical device over there, because unless you got the converter for it, they're going to fry it. So he starts this whole kind of smear campaign against Tesla. He gets like there was an elephant that had stampeded at a circus and killed a little girl. So he said, hey, let me have that elephant. He got the elephant, and he's filming this whole thing. Let it out to a metal floor, and then they sent electricity through that floor and basically electrocuted the elephant to death. And you see it collapse, and you see a little smoke come up. And Edison's like, this is what alternating current will do for you. Edison developed the first electric chair, made sure it was powered by AC, to make people try to be afraid, even though it was a superior system that was actually harmless. Do y'all ever watch epic rap battles of history? There's look up on YouTube. I can't show it to you here because whatever your blocker is saying, no, that's a bad thing. But there's epic rap battles of history, Edison v. Tesla. It's a funny one. Okay, now we'll talk about some industrial leaders. But let me go ahead and stop and restart. Okay, the first one we're going to talk about is Andrew Carnegie. Carnegie was born in Scotland. He came to America in 1848, and at the age of 13, he worked as a bobbin boy in a textile mill, earning just $1.20 a week. By 14, however, he was making $2.50 a week and was a telegraph messenger. And he spent his spare time listening to the telegraph, and he became so good at telegraphy that he could do it by ear. And indeed, he got to be so fast that by 1853, he became the personal secretary and telegrapher to Thomas Scott, who was the district superintendent of the Pennsylvania Railroad. Later on, when Scott became the president of the company, he took Carnegie with him. During the Civil War, he developed a military telegraph system for the Union. He even helped evacuate the wounded from Bull Run. And by 1865, he's really he gets involved with railroad bridge building, especially those made out of iron and steel. And by 1865, he quits the railroad to devote himself more to iron and steel. And then when he's over in Europe in 1872, making some money selling railroad bonds, he comes across Henry Bessemer. Y'all got it? Now, what did Henry Bessemer do? Henry Bessemer figured out a process that basically made steel the miracle metal. It used to be really expensive to try to make steel. Why? Because you had to have like the highest quality steel, because the more impurities that were in the steel, it would cause the steel to become like brittle and break. And so this high quality iron really raised up the price of the steel that was produced. However, Henry Bessemer figured out the Bessemer process. What's that? It was that at a certain temperature, when you have all the molten metals together to make the steel, when this reached a certain temperature, basically you blow air through the cauldron. And that would cause all the impurities that were in the iron and steel to rise to the top, becoming slag. And you just scrape that stuff off as it came out, and you had almost awesome steel below. And now you could buy the cheapest iron there was out there, because it didn't matter how many impurities there was in it, you were going to blow them all out anyway. This caused the price of steel to go down and its quality to skyrocket up. In 1860, we only made 13,000 tons of steel. By 1880, 1.4 million tons. Carnegie, he's no idiot. He comes back, he makes J. Edgar Thompson Steel Works, uses his money to expand, buying out Bessemer Steel Company's almost new factory, and the decaying Bessemer Steel Works, which he bought at less than cost. One of his secrets to success is he always surrounded himself with successful people. Also, he would modernize his equipment to make sure they were the most efficient. And he used times of recession for expansion. Kind of like, guys, if I were graduating from college right now, you know what I'd probably do? I'd start a restaurant or a coffee place. Why? We had a whole slew of them that had to close down because they just couldn't make it through the COVID halt that was put on them. And as we're starting to get over the COVID fright, people are still going to want to eat. They're still going to want to go and have, coffee. They're still going to want to go to the movies. And you can probably get that stuff cheap now. But just like anything, there's a risk to everything. So Carnegie, who made, and he was investing his money all the time, basically he was big time wealthy. And what did he believe about philanthropy? Well, he believed that he hated the word philanthropist. So he believed that he and other major leaders of industry should be distributors of wealth. You know, society made them wealthy, so it was kind of their duty to give back to that society. Now, he totally believed his gospel of wealth. He totally believed in competition. He thought it was good because that's the way you got the best products and the best people, is have them in competition. But he retires at age 65 and he devotes his life to giving his money away. He made a real sweet deal with J. Pierpont Morgan. Might be able to get to that today, I don't know. But basically, he tries to give his money away, but because he invested it so wisely, he's still making it faster than he can give it away. So he built like universities, he built like libraries, those Carnegie libraries, where he'd buy the land, he'd pay for the building, he'd pay for the books to go in that building, he'd pay for the librarian, until that city had the money to support it by itself. Like Dallas, our first library was a Carnegie library. And if you go to the downtown branch, you can see the cornerstone of that. And then there's some places in Texas, I think it's Electra, that got a Carnegie library and they never got the money to support it. So Carnegie Foundation is still supporting it. They built like hospitals, parks, halls. Anybody here ever heard of Carnegie Hall? Swimming pools. But the one thing that he didn't really like giving money to was churches. Now, was he not a spiritual man? How many of you guys go to church? Anything? Religious house? Well, guys, at every service, what do?
Offering.
Yeah, they take up the offering. Now, you guys don't know because you're pretty young, you know, and you're not out on your own and making it. But a lot of people, like especially my grandfather, who loved going out and getting better jobs and making more money so he'd have more money to give back to the church. It's an act of worship. It's, hey, God, thank you for giving this to me. You know, you're getting the first tenth. You know, like I know that whenever I really is an act of worship, it's a, hey, I want to see this church do something good with my money. I want to see. But anyway, he knew that for most people that's an act of worship, so they're kind of already in that game. So he didn't like giving to individual churches, even though sometimes he would give to the big organized thing of whatever that denomination is under, like Southern Baptist Conference for the Southern Baptists here in Texas. Okay, so he was the good. Well, now we've got the bad. Who's the bad? John D. Rockefeller. Basically, he was born to a con man and a devout Baptist mother who moved them from New York down to Cleveland. And then almost as soon as they got in Cleveland, he abandoned the family, took up with another woman, never saw John again. Now, John's mom, however, really raised up Rockefeller with strict self-discipline, making him driven by order, precision, and tidiness. And when they were in Cleveland, was at about the exact same time that the Pennsylvania oil rush occurred. Y'all got it? Now, what was the Pennsylvania oil rush? Well, basically in 1859 near Titusville, they dug their first well. Now in Pennsylvania, the oil fields were never that deep. I mean, anywhere from 25 to 75 feet deep. And because, you know, it's under pressure underground, every once in a while it would crack through, usually near rivers and streams. and some of the petroleum would just leak out naturally. Indeed, that's why my son, who went to a University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, their mascot is the Tar Heels, because basically they also had shallow petroleum, and during the Revolutionary Wars, men were running down the creeks and everything, they'd get petroleum on their shoes or feet, so they were the Tar Heels. Now, what would they use petroleum for back then? It's one of the basis levels of refining. I have the word right up there. Kerosene. Anybody here been camping? What do you use kerosene for in camping? Well, today you use natural gas. Because they kind of got away from camping fuel, which is nothing more than kerosene. Huh?
Fire.
Yeah, they've got those. Coleman has those old camping stoves. They used to use kerosene, so you use it for cooking. You'd also use it for your lanterns, for lighting. And guys, kerosene was a heck of a lot easier to control, cheaper, than anything. And so within 10 years, the petroleum in Pennsylvania quickly outpaced the economic importance of the California gold rush that had happened a decade prior. Now, Rockefeller was going to get in on the action. So he and his partner, by the name of Samuel Adams, no relation to anybody, went out and started their own refinery. Then they turned all the profits from that refinery into buying more refineries. And by 1870, they formed Standard Oil of Ohio, that later on would become known as Standard Oil. Everybody got it? Oops, wrong way, wrong way. Now, one of the things about the refining was that wrong one. I went ahead too fast. Basically, so many people were doing it, and it was totally unorganized. Now, why would that have bothered Rockefeller if refining was unorganized? Well, I'll tell y'all something. Y'all know that gas was pretty cheap here in America in like 1920s, 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s. It was pretty cheap. Because basically all the oil exporting countries were getting out as much as they could. No regulation. Which means there's way too much on the market, which is going to drag down the price. But then in 1973, when Egypt and Syria and our allies attacked Israel, and the U.S. supported Israel, Israel won. All of a sudden, a group of about 16 nations called OPEC got together and said, you know what? We're not going to pump out oil willy-nilly anymore. And gas shot up through the roof. Because there wasn't as much oil on the market, the price went up. Okay, indeed, we had our little hiccup when Bush was in office, where gas doubled. It went from like $2 to $4, and everybody was like, what? When OPEC was formed in 1963, gas went up 5 times. So instead of a gallon of gas costing $2, it would cost $10 a gallon. So needless to say, he wanted to stop all this bad oil from flooding the market. So in 1872, he formed the Southern Improvement Agency, making himself the marketing agent. And he would go to like railroads and say, hey, how's it going? Listen, I can guarantee you each week 20 cars of kerosene that are going out to New York City. And it costs you $6 to make a profit on that per car. I'll give you $6.05. And it's guaranteed. And you know me, I'm good for my word. Every week you will have that. So she says, okay, she takes me up on it. And She makes some good money. Well, then 2 weeks I come back and I say, hey, listen, her railroad said that she'd do it for $6. So you only charge me $5.95 a car, and you keep my business, or I'm going with her. She says, okay, and she said, well, I'll lose the money. But I'll be like the loss leader. I'm like the free Big Mac, because I want people coming into my restaurant to get the Coke and fries, which are huge markup items. And so basically you charge other people. Well, then I decide I want to put some refiners out of business. So I know that like his Magnolia oil has 6 carloads of kerosene that are supposed to be going out to things on the west. I say, hey, listen, why don't you make sure those cars get lost? Okay? She says, okay. Then I go to Magnolia Oil. Hey, Magnolia Oil, how's it going? Listen, I know that your company's worth $100,000. Tell you what, I'll pay you $75,000 for it. Deal? Okay, say no, that's fine. Okay. So anyway, after about 2 weeks, you're not making any money. None of this stuff is getting the market. You see me walking by on the street. Oh, Miss Rockefeller, yes. Remember you said you'd give me $75,000 for my company? I'll sell it to you now. Oh, that was a week ago. Now I'm only going to give you $70,000. And he'd say, okay. Basically, during the 6 weeks, Rockefeller felt that his competition should either be bought out, and if they can't be bought out, they need to be crushed out. And at the end, he owns 22 out of his 26 competitors. And by 1879, Standard Oil controls 90 to 95% of all petroleum production in the United States. And not only that, but he was big into vertical integration, which means you control everything from the pipelines that are taking it out of the ground, oil storage tanks, the railroad cars, everything you own. And not only that, but you can build the factories that manufacture them so you can sell them to other people. So you can try and make a profit off of it. Well, and then he really gets crazy and he develops the trust. Now, what's the trust? The trust was originally developed, somebody online knows some trust fund babies. The trust was originally developed like, say, me and my wife are rich, and we have a child that's mentally slow, challenged, has difficulties. We know that. And we know that when we die, she's helpless in the world. We're not going to know how to spend money. So what we do is we form a trust that says, okay, there's money here. And when we go, we're going to hire you to look over that money, to take care of that girl. That's the whole purpose for the trust. If that girl goes and burns down a building, you can't be sued because you allowed her to have the money to buy the matches or whatever. Because you are, the trust is what can be seen as accountable, not you. So you're basically legally not responsible. And basically he did that with Standard Oil, making this huge corporation that was led by directors that are just overseers of the trust, because he took that idea concept from the person to the corporation. But it still got to be too much for the Americans. They demanded that Standard Oil be broken up, which it was. And by that time, Standard Oil had become a holding company that basically bought stock in other companies and would, if you bought a percentage of their holding company, kind of like a mutual fund, you'd get a percentage of the dividends. All right, you ready for the next one? The ugly. J. Pearpoint Morgan. Now, unlike the earlier guys that we talked about, Morgan came from wealth. The other two guys, they weren't that wealthy. Indeed, he started working with his dad at his father's London's banking house in 1857. And by 1860, he crossed over the pond to start an investment house in America. And basically, Morgan and the investment banking, because he was in charge of getting Europeans to invest their money in our railroads, he was very important to corporate stocks and bonds, causing most companies to put him in a very strategic place within the company. All right. Basically, Morgan acquired and reorganized one railroad after the other. This stability helped both the economy and the public. Indeed, Morgan believed that businessmen had to be controlled or it would lead to anarchy. And then he went out after steel, and basically he consolidated the steel industry. He went to Andrew Carnegie and said, hey, tell me how much you want for all of your steel works. Now guys, if anybody ever asks to buy something, ask for a higher price than you think you'll get, because you might get that higher price. Morgan writes a number on a piece of paper, slides it over to, Carnegie writes a number on a piece of paper, slides it over to Carnegie. Carnegie opens up the piece of paper, says, okay, I'll have it for you on Monday. What was the number? 500 million. Then he takes the other steel things that he's bought, collects them all together, and forms a U.S. Steel, which was valued at $1.4 billion, making it America's first billion-dollar company. And it actually was up and running until 1970s. And there was talk of it reopening its doors under Trump. Ready for the next slide? Does anybody here ever heard of J. Paracord Morgan? Anybody ever heard that name?
Maybe like a JP Morgan.
Or maybe that's the exact same thing.
I know.
Now, of course, you also had robber barons. Guys that were just out to make a quick buck. Like Jay Gould, who basically would, totally ruin any industry he set his hands on. But he would make a profit out of it. Even though all his investors would totally lose everything. Indeed, one time he sold Mark Twain a bunch of stock on a railroad, and Twain invested in it. Well, it burnt Twain so bad, he lost so much money that he was ruined economically. He had to come out of retirement, wear this old graduation gown and cap that he had gotten from Yale. And he was so frightened, hold on, I gotta take the roll. He was so frightened that later on when he was offered entry stock at AT&T, he turned it down. So don't let fear. Okay, this should be where we left off last time. And we finished the slide. So we go from there to the worship of success. Guys, wealth in its pursuit really became idolized during this time. And one of the things that displays that is the popularity of Horatio Alger novels. Here's one helping himself. Even though I've never read the book, just from the cover I can tell you that on Saturdays this kid would go out and work selling newspapers, not going to the baseball games. And one day he met this fine young lady who so was impressed by him that she told her husband, who works at a bank, and he got a job at the bank, and he worked there for years until he finally became president. Now, is that actually going on? Well, maybe not. Between 1860 and 1900, the richest 2% owned more than a third of the nation's wealth, and the top 10% owned 3/4 of it. But what about the average guy? Well, the life of the haves and the have-nots, there was a rising standard of living. And while suddenly jumping into riches was rare, it was quite common for people to move from blue to white collar jobs, like manual labor to being a manager. Indeed, between 1860 and 1890, wages were up 50%. Ready? Now the working conditions. People made an annual salary, an average of about $490. Your work week was about 59 hours, unless you were a steel worker. If you were a steel worker, you might be putting in 84 hours. And of course, there was poor health and safety conditions both where you lived and where you worked. Like in the tenement or apartments that they lived in, the death rates were higher than the surrounding countryside. The factories were treacherous workplaces, where in 1913 there were 25,000 fatalities and 700,000 injuries. Now you might be asking, why did I put 1913 up there? I thought we were talking about the period from 1870 to the turn of the century. Guys, because 1913 was the first year they took numbers on it. So you can guess it was even higher before that. On that picture, by the way, is a picture of a bobbin boy. So that's what Andrew Carnegie was at first. Ready for the next slide? Hoo-wah! Well, there's also a change in working conditions. The working relationships are no longer personal. Indeed, now they're impersonal and contractual. You know, the worker might know more than the boss, but still the boss is over him. Why? Because at the end of the day, the bottom line is money. And your boss is accountable to his boss, who's accountable to his boss, so on, so on, so on, till you get up to the board of directors. And if it's a publicly traded company or one that sells stock, who are they responsible to? The stockholders. And how do stockholders vote? If it's a good stock, you buy more. If it's a bad stock, you sell it. And if you sell the stock, the company's losing money. So mirror, look at yourself. Oh no. Now let's go west. Now historically, there's been two different views of the West in America. The first view was that of a great American desert. This was popularized by Stephen Long, who took an expedition out there, saw an area wholly unfit for habitation. And this was largely believed until after the Civil War. Well, what changed after the Civil War? Well, we finally had a transportation infrastructure able to get out west. And once you have that possibility, you have people that want to sell land, you have people that want to take advantage of the untapped resources out there. So you had Western boosters, or guys that would buy and sell the land, trying to push for it. Also, you had a scientist, Charles Dana Wilbur, who said he could scientifically prove that all you had to go out there and start farming, and it would rain. Ready for the next one? Well, some people believed him. Factors that increased settlement from 1870s to the 1880s, it was a period of unseasonably high rainfall. By the mid-1880s, though, not only did it return to normal, but some places found themselves in drought. So you had a lot of families that packed up everything they owned on the wagons, painting "In God We Trusted" and "In Kansas We Busted." But still, through things like drip irrigation and ranching. Population did stay there. The numbers did grow. Colorado became a state in 1876. The Dakotas, Montana, and Washington became states in 1889. Idaho and Wyoming in 1890. And Utah finally became a state in 1896. Now, Utah actually could have gotten into the Union earlier, but they had something that the U.S. didn't like. They did something. Who were the crazy Utah people? Mormons. And what was the crazy thing they did? Had more than one wife. Joseph Smith said, hey, you're going to get more spirit worlds and everything like that. So the whole bigamy thing, U.S. didn't like that. But finally, in either 1875 or in 1895 or in 1896, it was revealed to the prophet. And the prophet is their leader, just like the Pope is the leader of the Roman Catholic Church. It was revealed to the prophet that, okay, you can just have one wife. No more multiple wives. And so pretty much after they did that, they were let into the Union, even though some Mormons did continue, but a lot of them split the state. Now, as you can guess, as people are moving west, there's people that are already living out there, Native Americans. So it should come as no surprise that from the 1860s through the 1870s, even petering into the 1880s, there was savage Indian wars that were going on all along the frontier. Well, in 1867, the U.S. government decides to write a report on it to see what they should do, called the Report on the Conditions of Indian Tribes. And the decision was made that it would be best for everybody if the Native Americans were put on reservations, kept apart. The only problem was, though, trying to convince the Native Americans that they should live on a reservation. One of the guys that was in the Great Sioux War, he was a guy of unbridled ambition. He wanted to be the president of the U.S. He went to West Point, where he graduated 48th out of his class of 50. So not great grades, but guys, apparently he was good in the military, because he is still the youngest general ever in the U.S. Army. He was real big on like blitzkrieg or lightning attacks. One day he went out with about between 150 to 180 men. He could have taken 2 Gatling guns with him, but he said no because it would just slow him down. They were out on reconnaissance. And near the Little Bighorn River, they came across a village of the Sioux and Cheyenne, and none of the men were around. Only the women and some spare horses. And they knew if they were able to take that out, they would do great damage to the war efforts of the Sioux and Cheyenne. So he starts going, making a beeline for the village. What he didn't see were about the 2,500 Sioux and Cheyenne that were on the other side of the hill that came around and and needless to say, they all got massacred. Well, then we have Chief Joseph. He was the leader of the Nez Perce. Now, if y'all remember, the Nez Perce was the Native American tribe that offered vital assistance to Lewis and Clark, making sure that their expedition would survive. Well, generations later, Chief Joseph wants to get out of America and go to Canada, because he doesn't want to live on a reservation. But the U.S. Army is blocking his passage up to Canada. So he goes on a 1,500-mile-long journey of retreat, the whole time telling his warriors, hey, don't cause atrocities, we're going to pay for everything, we just want to get out of here. And he made it 1,470 miles before he was stopped by the U.S. Army, 30 miles shy of his goal. It's there where he gave his speech. I'm tired of fighting. Our chiefs are dead. The old men are all dead. I want to have time to look for my children and see how many of them I can find. Hear me, my chiefs, I am tired. My heart is sick and sad. From where the sun now stands, I will fight no more forever. Then we have Geronimo, who was an Apache who successfully kept off an encroachment for about 15 years, fought against it. Finally, he's captured, where he's taken to Fort Sam in San Antonio. And on Fort Sam, they have a building called the Quadrangle. That's where the garrison commander used to live. That has a big enclosed courtyard in it. And in the middle of that, it's a cool courtyard. I mean, they got like deer in there. They've got peacocks. Anyway, in the middle of it, there's a tower. That's about 3 stories tall. So they put Geronimo in there. And according to legend, Geronimo jumped out of the 3rd story of the tower, tried to make a run for it, and they caught him and put him back in. Perhaps that's where we got saying, Geronimo, before you jump off something tall. Next big thing that happened was Chief Sitting Bull, who was a Sioux, up in the Dakotas, and there was Wachovia, a Paiute shaman, who fell into a delirium in 1888, and when he came out of the delirium, he said that he had met the Maker. And the Maker told him that if the people were to go back to the ways of old, not only would he give them back the land, but he'd also make them impervious to bullets. So one of the traditions they used to have that scared the willies out of the soldiers that were out there is they had the ghost dance, where on a new moon, y'all know what a new moon is. Yeah, when there's no moon in the sky. They'd paint themselves white and dance around a bonfire and scream out war chants. Well, they so desperately wanted to go back to the days of old, they started doing it 2 times a month, every new moon and every full moon. Needless to say, this was giving the U.S. soldiers the heebie-jeebies. And in 1890, they go to arrest Chief Sitting Bull, but he resists, which led to his death. The last big, and not only that, but then they went to a group of Indian braves that were surrendering, but a nervous soldier shot one of them, which led to 200 Indians dead and 25 American soldiers at the Battle of Wounded Knee. And that's the last big Native American battle that we talk about. Now, what caused the collapse of Native resistance? Well, a lot of it was the wiping out of the buffalo. Buffalo that used to be in herds so large that when the Transcontinental Railroad was going out there, it might have to stop and wait for as long as 5 days for the entire herd to cross the tracks. Well, by the 1870s, buffalo robes are really popular, and farmers, of course, hate them, so farmers would kill the buffalo. And when the Transcontinental Railroad was completed, basically they'd stop the train and the hunters would get out with their long rifles, get on the roofs of the railroad cars, take pot shots at the buffalo and kill them off. Skin them and leave the meat out there to rot in the sun. But you also got to know, that's sad. Also at the same time, Native Americans they used to only kill as many buffalo as could be naturally replenished by the herd. Well, they were killing more than the herd could naturally reproduce. So they're even being overhunted by the Native Americans. And so with their main food supply gone, clothing, it's like Walmart, the Native Americans did eventually go to the reservations. Well, almost as soon as that's over, Helen Hunt Jackson writes a book, A Century of Dishonor, that was kind of like Uncle Tom's Cabin in its popularity on something that happened. This caused a lot of people in Washington to pass the Dawes Servility Act. Now, this is also referred to as the Dawes Act. Basically, its plan was to Americanize the Native Americans. Now, how was it going to Americanize the Native Americans? Well, it was going to give them land. It was going to give every head of household 160 acres and give lesser amounts to other members of the family. But politicians being politicians, they thought the Indians, they don't know how to own land yet. So we got to hold it in trust form for 25 years. And during that 25 years that the land was in the trust of the government, 86 million of the 130 million acres that had been set aside were sold off or given to other organizations. That's why today there's a lot of Native American nations that are suing the U.S. government to get their land back. Now, why might a Native American tribe want to get more reservation land? Well, have y'all ever been on a reservation? A lot of people in Dallas go to 2 reservations that are kind of near us. One's Windstar. And the International. Those casinos are on Indian reservations. And that's why they want their land back, so they can open more casinos. Even though I kind of feel sad for my people, the Cherokee, is Tahlequah, there's no big, Oklahoma City. But they don't get that much business. But the chief, they get a lot. But the chief basically funnels the profits of that, puts it into like a medical care as well as housing for the people of his nation. And they also own like half of the Hard Rock Cafe in Oklahoma City. All right, now cowboys, hee-haw! Now cattle ranging has always happened in the West, very common on just the frontier of settlement. Indeed, a lot of words and items that cowboy culture uses are taken from Spanish. There's like when Jose Escandon was over here settling the southernmost tip of Texas. He founded the town of Laredo. Basically, the ranchers would keep all their ranches on this side of the Rio Grande River and then recross the river and spend the night on the other side, come back out in the morning to where their herds were. Words that came from Spanish are like rodeo, Mustang, lariat. Even the saddle that the cowboys use is a Spanish saddle, not an English saddle. Now what's the difference between the two? Huh?
Like what do you mean? Like the type of saddle?
Yeah, what's the difference between a Spanish and an English saddle?
Spanish saddle is smaller, doesn't have
That's the English saddle.
That's an English saddle.
that's not like that English one.
What does the Spanish saddle have? Specifically, it has the horn, and the saddle horn for the rope and everything. Now, when the veterans from Texas are coming back from the Civil War, they find that there's more than 5 million Longhorns, which are descendants of the Spanish that are known for their endurance. They can walk a long way without water or food, even though their meat is but they can endure and they don't lose a lot of weight. And up in the north, all of their herds were wiped out during the Civil War. So how are we going to get our cows up north to satisfy that problem? The great cattle drives. Samuel Maverick here in Texas, you still have to register your brand. Samuel Maverick was a big guy in San Antonio, kind of a prankster, and all of his herd was on an island. So he didn't want to have to go out and brand them, so he registered his brand with the state as no brand. And after he got that registered, he said, hey, well, all these wild cattle are also mine. Ha ha ha. Everybody said, oh, Sammy. First cattle drive was driven up to Salina, Missouri from Texas, which was the western terminus of the Missouri Pacific Railroad. It was subject to raids by post-war bushwhackers and opposition by Arkansas and Missouri farmers. But it made it through and made a lot of money. Joseph McCoy was the youngest of 3 brothers who turned Abilene, Kansas into a booming cow town with the help of part Cherokee Jesse Chisholm and his Chisholm Trail. Abilene was changed from a small dead place consisting of about a dozen log huts in 1867 to a flourishing town by 1869. Indeed, the population of Kansas during that period rose from 107,000 to 365,000. And 10 years later, they were almost at 1 million people. Nebraska was similar. Basically, cattle were driven across the open plains to railheads where they could be sold to agents for high profits. Now, of course, this was based on weight. So I buy these cows based on their weight, but then they get taken to like New York or Massachusetts. What's happening to that cow the whole way it's going? It's losing weight, so I'm losing profits. But with G.H. Hammond, he developed the air-cooled railroad cars, which could keep the meat kind of refrigerated, but it would stay good long enough so that it could be killed and slaughtered earlier and then taken to the northern markets. And that's what made Chicago. It had a lot of slaughterhouses in it. Augustus Swift, by the time we get up there, we have air-conditioned railroad cars. And he was the guy that pretty much made whatever you see in the supermarket, like Tom Thumb, Albertsons, Kroger. You know, he was the one that started that, where the butchers all wear white so they look clean, where all the meat is behind glass. And today, if it's you know, like steaks that are out on the rack, it's in cellophane so you can see through it. About the only meat product that isn't in a see-through thing is the big 10-pound bag of hamburger. Because they're like, look, it's hamburger, you know what this is going to be. Now, why do you think and he also knew that the smaller you cut, the higher the profits. Now, why did he insist that it was like see-through stuff and everything like that? Because people used to buy their meat from a side of beef, where you'd see the whole half of the cow. And people didn't trust buying it separately like that. Why?
It's like, if they were able to see the whole side, like they could see what the good meat, like what is good meat that they buy.
Yeah.
And like now, like with baking packages, like they'll cut up and it'll be like super, super fatty on one side, but they'll hide it like cooking it on the side you can see.
Yeah, well, not only that, but guys, meat goes bad. And you got a whole side of beef, parts of the meat are going to go bad quicker than other parts, and if you can see from the side of the cow, hey, that meat's starting to turn, you're not going to buy any meat from that cow. And if you just buy the individual things, you don't know how the cow was that it came from. Indeed, that whole deal about meat going bad is why barbecue really kicked off here in the South, because high humidity, high heat turned meat bad kind of quick. So when the meat was starting to turn, but hadn't gone bad yet, they said, you know what, let's find a way to cook this thing, put a real sharp sauce on it to help disguise the fact that it's going bad. Now, over 40,000 cowboys roamed the Great Plains during the 20 years of the cattle drives. Most of them were young. The average age was 24. They were from diverse backgrounds. Indeed, 30% were African or Mexican American. Their numbers included Civil War vets from both sides, and some people even came over here from Europe. Now, it's hard to believe that for only 20, oh, and by the way, because of the cowboy, that's what helps a lot of people to not realize that Texas was in the Confederacy during the Civil War. Because, bam, almost right after the Civil War, that kicked off. Well, what killed the cattle drives? Well, the romantics among us will say it was the invention of barbed wire, which had been invented back in 1873. Joseph Glidden made a rudimentary way to make barbed wire. John W. bet $1 million Gates then set up a barbed wire corral in San Antonio. This is like in the mid-1880s, so a lot of time had passed, and he said that he challenged anybody who had a bull that could break through his barbed wire, he'd give him $500. Well, you don't give a Texan a challenge like that. So all these ranchers got their bulls, the meanest ones. They made them extra angry, like you can make a cow extra angry for a rodeo. Threw them into the corral. It would rush towards the fence, but as soon as it felt the barbs going into its skin, it'd back off. Basically, no bull was able to break through. He called barbed wire light as air, stronger than whiskey, and cheaper than dirt. That sounds romantic, but the real reason why the great drives stopped, because the railroads finally got to where the cows were. So they didn't have to make these huge drives. I just love those Dixie chicks. Huh?
The chicks?
Oh yeah, how cool. Because Earl's gone, Dad. Okay. I lost my clock. All right, now farmers out west. Basically, the big problem out there is the land. The Great Plains is a very unforgiving landscape. Now, to try to help out the Americans, in 1862, Washington passed the Homestead Act that basically said, hey, you move out west, we're going to give you 360 acres, you live on it for 5 years, you get it for free. And tell you what, if you live on it for just 6 months, we'll let you buy it for $1.25. Now wait a minute, why would people buy land for $1.25 an acre when they could just live on there 4.5 more years and have it for free? What do you think people were doing to the land? Yeah, they were flipping it. So you go out there, you chop down some trees, maybe build a log cabin, prepare some of the things for farming, sell it for $1.30. And then move out a little further west, do the exact same thing again. Now then, later on, to help the farmers out there with like irrigation and stuff like that, they passed the Newlands Reclamation Act, which was funded by these sales that built new reservoirs. And reservoirs like the Boulder Dam, the Roosevelt Dam, and others were part of that Newlands Reclamation Act that got the funding that way. Now the farmer's life, the land was cheap, but everything else wasn't. Indeed, the freight charges charged by the railroads, that's what they pay you to either deliver or send back to the east. It was 6 times higher per mile out west than it was in the east. Why? Because there was so much more traffic in the east. And not a lot of railroads went out west. They also had a very harsh environment. I mean, the soil was hard, difficult to break. You might have locusts that come and eat your crops, and a fire might sweep through, caused by lightning. Very difficult. Now, there were technological advances that they could avail themselves of. For example, they have like sod houses, where instead of building their house out of wood because there's not a lot of trees out there, you can save it by piling up sod. So you live kind of in a hobbit hole. John Deere in 1838 developed a steel-faced plow, which was good at breaking up the dirt, but it was expensive because they hadn't developed the Bessemer process yet. James Oliver came out with designed a much cheaper sod buster in 1868 that was much more affordable. Then he had things like the McCormick Reaper that you used to be able to harvest 2 acres in 1 day. Now, with the McCormick Reaper, you could harvest 2 acres in 1 hour. So you started having these huge bonanza farms, like where people, just one farmer would farm a whole big slew of land. One reporter that rode by a bonanza farm in a train even commented that it was like, looking out the windows, it was like riding a boat through a sea of grain. Now, politics in the Gilded Age. Guys, basically it was incredibly corrupt. And we didn't really get involved with other countries. Remember, we had survived the Civil War. where we had almost killed ourselves as a nation. And basically, we saw ourselves as an island of democracy. We got these two big, huge oceans on both sides. Everybody else in the world we can forget about and not worry about it. And we'll be fine. Now, the cities were exploding with growth so quickly, we didn't really know how to handle it. And you didn't have all these city services. So basically, urban politics and political machines were relied on to take care of problems. The most famous of these was Tammany Hall up in New York City, led by Boss Tweed, where basically if you wanted a street repair, you'd go to him, you'd pay him money, he'd take part of it for himself, but he'd get a crew together out and they'd go and take care of it. Now this corruption wasn't just on the local level, but it was on the national level as well. I mean, y'all remember the Credit Mobilier scandal, that railroad company that got legislation passed so they could get more money. They bribed congressmen as much as their annual salaries to vote their way. Ready for the next one? Basically, it's the politics of dead center. Things don't change much. I mean, every Republican candidate for president had served in the Union Army. The Democrats dominated the South, as well as Catholic votes. Parties were divided and national elections were very close. And we had a very weak president. Basically a yes man. Ever since Johnson almost got impeached. Congress is pretty much running the roost. And when you do have a candidate that pushes for reform, they're rewarded by being thrown out of office. And voter turnout was extremely high. Oh my gosh, both the singers that sang this song are dead. Oh my God. We ready? The national politics, its structure is ill-equipped to deal with the rapid growth. I mean, it just can't do it. A really hot topic for both parties was tariffs. Now, what is a tariff? A tax on what kind of goods?
Imported.
Yeah, tax on foreign goods. Now, if we have a high tariff, who is that good for?
America.
Why is that good for America?
We buy in America.
Yeah, because they buy America. And but that's good for the North, but in the South and the West it sucks. Because if we put high tariffs against them, they're going to respond by putting high tariffs against us. So I'm going to be getting paid less for my goods. Meanwhile, the American goods that I buy, well, they're going to charge a little bit more because they'll still be cheaper. So now I'm making less money and I have to pay more to get the goods. So usually they're against it. And also they returned to the gold standard in 1879, where you can only have as much money in circulation as you have gold and the value of that gold. Now that's good in one way, in that it increases the value of the dollar, because the dollar is limited, how much of it can be produced. The weakness of it is that there's not enough money printed to keep up with the wealth that's actually going on. So the average capita money that people had went from $30 to $27, even though those $27 are worth more. Ready for the next one? All right, government and the economy. Basically, the Republicans, they favor their economic policies, favor Eastern businesses. They did get the Civil Service Act of 1883 passed, which put in a merit system, saying crazy stuff like if you were a mailman, you had to be able to read. But other requirements, minimum requirements that government employees had to meet. Congress also established the Interstate Commerce Commission in 1887, because the federal government does have the power to regulate interstate commerce, and now there's so much interstate commerce going on because we're so connected. That happens in 1887, and part of that is the Sherman Antitrust Act, built in to put limitations on corporate power. Meanwhile, political conflict in the states. During this time, the state government expands its responsibilities to the public, making the city's restaurant boards and health boards have more input from public employees. You have third parties that enjoy short successes, like the Greenback Labor Party was one of these parties. Their big deal was they wanted more money printed. They were really big in Texas from 1880 to 1884. That was about it. Farmers began to organize with the Grange. That was kind of a community hall where everybody from the surrounding area would get together. And at first it was to talk about things that they could do to corporately or altogether help themselves, but soon it moves into a political thing. And some states even pass 8-hour work days. Now wait a minute, how the heck is an 8-hour work day gonna help me? I'm working 12 hours. Why would states pass an 8-hour work day? Well, because that company still needs 12 hours of labor. And so if I'm limited to 8, there's 4 hours of labor they still need. Well, you work with me, you used to work 12 too, now you can only work 8, so both of our lives, ouch, hurt, because we can only work 8. But now with that extra 8 hours that's open up, they're gonna hire you. Growth of the American culture. First, you look at the growth of educational opportunities. They want to Americanize the immigrant workers. So we now also begin secondary schools, like high schools. There's 800 of them in 1880, 6,000 by 1900. Vocational schools were really pushed in the South. There's a picture of Tuskegee Institute that was built by Booker T. Washington. The Morrill Act of 1862 granted each state 30,000 acres per representative and senator, the proceeds of which were to be applied to teaching agricultural and mechanical arts. There is only one state that the national government did not provide the money for its A&M school. That's because this state, unlike any other state in the Union, owns all of its own land. What state's that? Well, I can tell you the name of the A&M school. Texas A&M. Texas. In Texas, we did it ourselves. Yes, sir? Seaman Knapp was called the schoolmaster to American agricultural. He led agricultural education, beginning with demonstrations in Texas on how to deal with Mexican boll weevil. Oops. Higher education. Well, the college student population in 1870 was 52,000. By 1890, it was up to 157,000. And by 1900, it's up to 600,000. Basically, they sought to instill discipline, morality, and curriculum, stressing mathematics and the classics, possibly even theology. But with changing times, they began to adopt electives allowing both students and colleges to expand their scope. Now, women in higher education, their attendance improved markedly, and most state universities in the West were open to women, like Vassar opened in 1865, which was the first women's college that had equal standards to that of male colleges. By the 1870s, we had Wesleyan Smith. And now that we have more colleges opening up, we need places to train the professors that are going to be teaching those classes. So, you have graduate studies. Ready? Now, popular culture. Most of the popular culture in this time began in the cities. The rural societies remained pretty much tied to rituals of harvest seasons or connected to their neighbors and extended cities. In the cities, they're not dependent on like ministers or harvest rituals for entertainment. The growing middle class were mobile, and their affluence afforded them leisure time, or time that could be spent doing whatever you want to do. Creative businessmen like P.T. Barnum and James A. Bailey were able to entertain in circuses, and one reporter came that at least it gave them something to talk about. And in another parts, form of entertainment was political, as well as civic responsibility. People would flock to hear candidates speak. Or the same thing for like social clubs, labor unions, etc. Indeed, you know that whole, have you ever heard that song? It's time to roll up the barrel, have us a barrel of fun. Basically, they'd sing that at the end of a political speech because that was a barrel of beer that the candidate would give away free. Meanwhile, you also had like traveling acts, like William Buffalo Bill Cody's, who was a Medal of Honor winner, who had shifted around in jobs until 1883, when he assembled a traveling spectacle that included real Native Americans, elk, buffalo. They do rope tricks. You had Annie Oakley, who was a sharpshooter, who, by the way, he paid the Indians, and he paid Annie Oakley just as much as he paid everybody else. Cody referred to himself as a young, sturdy, remarkable specimen of manly beauty with a brain to conceive and the body and nerve to execute. The exemplar of the strong and unique traits that characterize a true American frontiersman. And in his shows, he would carry out a reenactment of Custer's last stand, except Custer would win. And upon his death in 1917, the show dismantled. Also, they had something called magic lantern shows, where basically it would be like, you know, an overhead projector was shooting the light up on screen, and people would pass like colored plates over it, and ooh, ah. And before you go, wow, they must not have been very smart. You know what's really hard to believe is that 200 years from now, people are going to look at our TV and our movies and go, wow, how could they watch that stuff? Didn't they have exocentric, whatever entertainment is by then? You also have the rise of professional sports. Because you have more colleges as well as a transportation network, team sports start to become very popular. First was baseball, where teams would travel from city to city. As blacks weren't allowed to be in the white leagues, you had the Negro leagues that started about the same time. The National League was the only league in town until the American League came out in 1901. And what the National League did was it captured all the big cities. The American League, it went to the smaller markets. But it captured a lot of them. And so the National League couldn't put the American League out of business. So they said, hey, you know what? Instead of working against each other, let's work together. They joined together. And in 1903, they had the first World Series, which was played between the Boston Red Sox and the Pittsburgh Pirates, with the Red Sox winning. Theories of social change, reality versus theory. Well, about this time you have Charles Darwin's Origin of the Species come out. Well, actually back in 1857. But it takes it a while to get over here. Basically, on the HMS Beagle, he went to the Galapagos Islands that had totally unique animals and fauna. That basically, because it had been so isolated, this is where he started to believe that things evolved through natural selection. In other words, survival always went to the best, fastest, and quickest to whatever environment it was in. Well, you have people like Herbert Spencer that put this and tried to put Darwinism to all aspects. You know, the best, the fastest, and the quickest. So for him, the individual is awesome. And any government interference on the individual is bad. Just like I told you about having a 12-hour workday. And she had one too. Well, both of y'all, the government reduced that. That's not right. That's not fair. If she wasn't able to get a job, then she shouldn't be allowed to live. He thought that charity was evil. Why would charity be evil?
Because those people are working for the big.
Well, it's taking from those who have earned and giving to those who haven't. You know, kind of like, sadly, you know, those guys on the street corners, you know, that you might give them $1, while the next day you go back, they're still there. So, you know what I do? Especially in the summer, is I carry around a cooler of water bottles with me. If I see someone, I give them a water bottle. You also have Reformed Darwinism that says, no, Spencer, you're totally wrong. We're humans, we are not animals. Basically, God gave us the ability to get together, and their two goals that would help out society were to eliminate poverty and to promote education. All right. Okay, this is where our last shot ended when we were talking about Reformed Darwinism, where people like Lester Frank Ward said, hey, government could actually become the agency of progress. There were two main goals that society should work on to make it better. Basically, eliminate poverty and promote education. And by doing that, that would make us a better society, where everyone could be faster, quicker, and better. All right, realism in social studies. You start to have scientific histories appear. This first began in Germany, but now in America it's starting to come. I mean, before this, you had like, you know, George Washington saying that he chopped down the cherry tree with a hatchet. Well, that probably never actually happened. But that story was created to convey what a kind of stand-up guy George Washington was. Well, now with scientific histories, you have to provide evidences and proof to support your arguments. William James was a pragmatic. He was a professor of philosophy and psychology at Harvard. He said truth arose from the testing of new ideas and the application of in other areas. John Dewey, meanwhile, he was known as an instrumentalist because ideas were instruments. And children needed to be taught history, geography, and science to expand their experience. And at the schools, kids needed not only knowledge, but he stressed that they also needed a critical intelligence to cope with a complex modern world. Okay, getting ready to go to the new slide. If you don't have the notes, just pause it and go to the next slide when you're ready. Here we go. Realism in literature. Basically, novels started to say you could find universal truths in local life and the power of nature. Mark Twain is an excellent example of this. He was originally born Samuel Longhorn Clemens, but he took up the name Mark Twain. He was the author of numerous books like Innocents Abroad, Roughing It, but his best-known works came from reflections on his boyhood, and like The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, which came out in 1884, was considered a masterpiece. Basically, Huck embodied the myth of the red-blooded American boy lighting out for the territory, and whenever polite society tried to civilize him, he'd just go. Ernest Hemingway wrote all modern American literature comes from one book written by Mark Twain called Huckleberry Finn. Well, now you also had literary realism, like Henry James. Most of his adult life was spent as an expatriate in London. He wrote Portrait of a Lady in 1881, The Ambassadors in 1903. Basically, he talked about real people with real problems, devoid of kind of romantic delusions and dreams. You also had authors like Stephen Crane, because you started to have an introduction of scientific determination. In his Red Badge of Courage, he portrayed people caught in an environmental situations beyond their control. His first book was actually called Maggie, a Girl of the Streets, where he depicted a tenement girl driven to prostitution and death that was so sordid that Crane basically had to publish it himself. Jack London, meanwhile, was a big-time believer in German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche and his Superman theory. In his works, he wrote about brute force and will. Basically, those were tools that you needed desperately to survive. Getting ready to go to the next slide. Now, social criticism. You had, basically, they harbored intense hatred at the human misery that was going on. And they each had their own ways to try to solve it. Henry George, in his Progress and Poverty, he wanted to find the reason for poverty, and basically he believed that the basic problem was the unearned increment in wealth by those who own land. In other words, if you own land, it's probably going to go up in value. And he didn't think that was fair. Henry Demarest Lloyd's Wealth Against Commonwealth, he basically attacked the injustice of the industrial monopolies. His book was an expose on Standard Oil, where he saw the key to progress was in cooperation, not corporation. He believed that morality lied in the workers, not in the owners, and industry was only concerned about the growth of dollars, not civilization. Now, Thorstein Veblen, his theory of the leisure class, which came out in 1899, was actually an interesting book. I mean, the guy was a terrible teacher, but he was a brilliant writer. He claimed that the middle and upper classes had to spend so much time, like golfing or going out for lunches. They had to do that to show others that they belong in their class. And the upper classes, therefore, must consume time unproductively to show that they have the ability to afford a life of leisure. You know, they have to belong to the country club. They have to go on yachting. They have to take vacations to show everybody else, hey, I deserve to be rich, just like the rich people around me. Now, Edward Bellamy, his book, Looking Backward, 2000 to 1887, was a book where his character, Julian West, fell asleep for 100 years, only to wake up to find a society completely transformed. Everybody in the future lived with equal shares, and labor was equally divided. You know, kind of a socialist utopia. Getting ready for the next slide. Well, the social gospel. How does religion respond to Darwin? Well, you had the institutional church. As the middle classes moved out to the suburbs, their churches followed. From 1865 to 1888, 17 Protestant churches in Manhattan left when the population did. Indeed, in the center of Chicago, 60,000 residents had no church whatsoever. Now, some churches responded to the desperate needs of the people and devoted resources to community service. You had like the YMCA, or Young Men's Christian Association, that came to us from England in the 1830s, but it really took off in 1876. Churches began to develop social institutions such as gymnasiums, libraries, lecture rooms, and other facilities. Indeed, Russell Cromwell's Baptist Temple in Philadelphia even included a night school for the working people, and eventually that grew into Temple University. Now, Washington Gladden was a preacher from Columbus, Ohio, who preached the social gospel from the pulpit. He said that Christianity lied not in rituals, dogmas, mystical experiences of God, but the principle of love thy neighbor as thyself. Ready to go to the next slide? The settlement house movement. Well, the settlement house movement was based on Toynbee Hall. The first one started in London, England, where an English vicar invited students to join him in settling a depraved section of London. But by 1900, there were more than 100 settlement houses in America, with the most famous one being Jane Addams' Hull House, where middle-class, college-trained women sought to broaden their horizons and improve the lives of the impoverished. They would put their children into clubs and kindergartens, nursery schools were provided, they promoted health clinics, lectures, music and art studios. They might teach skills like savings and bookbinding. But Jane Addams began to feel that her settlement house in the spreading slums was as effective as trying to bail out the oceans with a teaspoon. She needed political support. Ready to go to the next slide? So basically, they got into politics. They were able to get housing laws passed, public playgrounds built, juvenile courts created, mothers' pensions for widows, workers' compensation laws if a worker got injured, as well as some legislation against child labor. And they established the Federal Children's Bureau in 1912. And in 1931, Jane Addams received the Nobel Peace Prize. Ready for the next slide? Women in movements. First off, women in the workforce. As the population grew, the number of women in the workforce increased. In 1880, there's 2.6 million. By 1890, there's 4 million. By 1900, it's 5.1 million. And by 1910, 7.8 million. Did it totally change society who believed in the cult of domesticity? Remember that, where the woman's job was to stay home and take care of the kids? Well, no. Domestic work remained the highest employer, but women did begin to make inroads into clerical work, like being a stenographer, a bookkeeper, etc. And some found sales jobs. Well, this spread to education, which leads some women to pursue professional careers. Indeed, in 1849, Elizabeth Blackwell became the first woman to complete medical school. And by 1868, she helped to open a medical school for women. By the 1880s, 3% of the physicians in America were women. But by the 1900s, medical schools began to impose harsher restrictions against women, so there were fewer of them. Indeed, the field of law held out even more restrictions against female lawyers that they didn't start to release until the 1960s. Ready for the next slide? All right, other women's reform organizations. You have that should say the YWCA, or the Young Women's Christian Association, that was formed in 1866. It appeared in Boston and spread elsewhere. You have the New England's Woman Club by Julia Howe. Basically, it also consisted of middle and upper class women, supported the cult of domesticity. They had a lot of reading or art appreciation societies. But in 1904, Sarah Plain Decker said, "Dante is dead. He has been dead for several centuries, and I think it is time that we dropped our study of his Inferno and turned our attention to our own." So women began to form opposition to things like prostitution, the abolition of child labor laws, temperance, like the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which formed in 1874. Basically, that was against alcohol. Now, it was true for the lower classes as well. You had the National Women's Trade Union League in 1903 that formed to bring educated middle-class women together with working women for the benefit of women unionists. Now, politically, after the Civil War, Susan B. Anthony wanted the 14th Amendment to include women. However, most people in our society at that time believed that a woman's place was still in the home. By 1969, there's a split in the movement. A group led by Lucy Stone, Julia Howe, and others formed the Women's Suffrage Association that focused solely on getting the right to vote. And the National Women's Suffrage Association promoted many feminist causes, because you had new generations of activists taking over from Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susie B. Anthony. Ready for the next slide? Well, what were some of the accomplishments of women that were trying to get the right to vote? Well, some Western states had full suffrage. Like in 1869, the territory of Wyoming gave women the right to vote, and it retained it in 1890 when it became a state. Colorado gave women the right to vote in 1893. Utah and Idaho gave it in 1896. Now, the movement lost a little steam when California turned down women's suffrage in 1896, but new energy was sprung into it when Washington voted to give women the right to vote in 1910. California finally passed it in 1911, as did Arkansas, Kansas, and Oregon, making a total of 9 western states that gave women the right to vote. Now, why were the western states doing this? Basically because they wanted to A, keep the women they had, and B, attract more women to come to those states. Now, of course, you had fewer and later successes in the East. By 1913, Illinois granted the presidential and municipal suffrage to women, but it wasn't until New York in 1917 gave female suffrage that others started to come into line as well. Ready for the next slide? Early worker protest. Okay, reasons for the slow growth of the unions. After the Civil War, demand for labor increases union membership, but many of these were immigrant workers that spoke different primary languages and brought with them over here ethnic animosities, memories of the old country. And also a big thing hindering unions was that the method of production, or all the machines that made everything, were in the hands of the owners. So the owners could fire people and replace them. Ready for the next slide? The National Labor Union. Now in 1866, 77 delegates from the National Labor Union wanted 8-hour workdays, they wanted worker cooperatives, greenbacks, and they wanted equal rights for both women as well as African Americans. Everything was looking good, but the leader died and the support for the movement faded away. Ready for the next slide? What? Hold on. Okay. Next, we're going to look at the Molly Maguires. Basically, they were miners that were up in the coal fields of eastern Pennsylvania in 1870. They got the name Molly Maguires because he was an Irish rebel, and a lot of the men that were working in the mine were Irish. Basically, they were provoked by terrible working conditions and the owners' brutal efforts to destroy unity. The Maguires utilized intimidation, beating, and even killings to right perceived wrongs. The terrorism that they created reached its peak in 1874 to 1875. That's when the company decided to use Pinkerton agents. Pinkertons were actually the first detectives, but they used them to kind of infiltrate the group undercover and collect information. And they were able to get enough evidence to indict the leaders. There was a trial in 1876 where 24 were convicted, 10 were hung. And meanwhile, with the resistance now gone at the mines, the owners reduced the wages of the miners. Ready for the next slide? The Great Railroad Strike of 1877. Now guys, this was even more significant because it was interstate. basically, why was it caused? Well, it was provoked by a reduction of wages. In 1873, the railroad had cut wages following a financial panic or a depression. In 1877, when things were getting a little bit better, it reduced the wages another 10%, which prompted the workers at Martinsburg, West Virginia, to walk off the job and to block the tracks. Well, basically, this strike spread across the country. Walkouts and sympathy spread to hundreds of cities. In Pittsburgh, they protested against the use of double-header lines, which pulled 2 engines that utilized less workers. You had looting, rioting, and burning property take place almost everywhere. And public sympathy at first was so great that the local militiamen called out to disperse the workers. Instead of dispersing them, they actually joined them. The militia was called out from Philadelphia to disperse one crowd at the cost of 26 workers. But they soon found themselves besieged and surrounded in the railroad blockhouse, where they disbanded and pretty much shot their way out. One reporter said of the damage that it was the most horrible ever witnessed, except in the carnage of war. 50 miles of hot rails and tons on tons of car skeletons and wheels, almost at a white heat. Ready for the next slide? But the strike pretty much was a failure. It had no real leaders, so there was no direction. And eventually the strikers, lacking organization and collectivization, had no choice but to go back to work. Although some were worried about a socialist revolution like the one that had taken place in Paris in 1871, and in California, the unions turned into a political movement that was known as the Sandlot Incident, where a meeting to show sympathy for workers quickly turned into attacks on Chinese immigrants. Leader Dennis Kearney organized the Workingmen's Party of California, and by 1878 he won a number of seats on the Constitutional Convention that packed the 1879 legislature, and he became the mayor of San Francisco in 1882. And he vowed to prevent Chinese immigration for 10 years because he was afraid they were taking jobs. Okay. Then we get to the Noble and Holy Order of the Knights of Labor, also known as the Knights of Labor. It was founded by Uriah S. Stevens, and in 1873 they had their first district assembly. When it had originally started in 1869, when he was a tailor that joined together with 9 other tailors. They had a slow initial growth, but during the Depression of 1873, while other unions were shutting down, the Knights of Labor was growing. And by 1878, they had their first General Assembly, which had delegates from members of other states, making them a national organization. Ready for the next slide? Now, what did the Knights of Labor want? Well, they wanted cooperatives where everybody would own like the tools and everything that they'd share amongst themselves. They wanted the creation of a Bureau of Labor Statistics. They wanted mechanics' lien laws to be able to be used. A lien law is basically if a guy doesn't pay you for a repair on like your car, let's say you take your car to a garage and you don't pay the mechanic, after a certain amount of time, the mechanic can file for a lien and basically get the title to your car. Because he's already put his labor and his tools, so he's invested into that. They wanted the elimination of convict labor, because basically people used to go and work out deals with wardens at prison and hire the prisoners to do work really cheap. They wanted an 8-hour workday. They wanted equal pay for all, regardless of sex or race. They preferred boycotts to strikes. Now, why would you do a boycott where you say don't buy goods instead of a strike? Well, if you go on strike, then you're not making any money. Basically, anybody, oh, it comes up on the next slide. Anybody could join, save lawyers, doctors, bankers, and those who sold liquor, because they saw those as the common enemy of the working man. Ready for the next slide? Okay, well, under Terrence V. Powderly, they saw their greatest successes. He was elected Grandmaster Workman in 1879, or the leader of the group. And by the mid-1880s, the Knights continued to grow. He actually pulled a successful strike against Union Pacific and Jay Gould's railroads that the workers were amazed at. They could win. Basically, Gould had reduced wages on the Missouri, Kansas, Texas, and Wabash Railroad. Organizers moved in and Gould received full pay. Well, was this truly a desperate sign to some desperate people that something could work? Yes. His membership grew from just 100,000 to 700,000 in 1 year, from 1885 to 1886, because he gave the workers hope. Ready for the next slide? Well, Gould didn't like to be tricked, and they try another strike against Gould. Basically, in 1886, he set a trap for the Knights of Labor, firing a foreman in his Texas Pacific shop down in Waxahachie. The Knights went on strike, and he refused arbitration or to sit down and talk with them about it. And he hired the Pinkerton agents to harass the strikers and keep the trains running. So pretty much the Knights had to call off the strike. Ready for the next slide? Now, the Haymarket Affair. In 1884, the workers at International Harvester wanted an 8-hour workday. And they told their bosses that back in 1884, and they wanted to see it done by May 1st, 1886. Well, by May 1st, it hadn't happened. So Chicago became a meeting place. And on May 3rd, there's a clash at the International Harvester plant where one striker was killed. Ready? So the next day, there's a big meeting at Haymarket Square, which is viewed by some historians as an incredible miscarriage of justice. They began their this is 8 blocks from City Hall. There were thousands gathering in Haymarket Square, including anarchists. And as the crowd was beginning to break up, when about 180 policemen arrive and demand that they break the meeting up, well, of course, when this happens, they all join back in. No, we're not going. Yeah. Then someone somewhere threw a bomb, which killed one cop and wounded 6 others. Police then fire into the crowd, arresting numerous people. Ready for the next slide? And despite any evidence, we still don't know who threw the bomb. 7 anarchist leaders were sentenced. 2 were later released. 1 committed suicide, and 4 were hung. All but one of these guys was German speaking, was a German immigrant. The only English speaker, that guy also was from Texas. He was also married to a black woman who had been published, and he just happened to be holding a membership card to the Knights of Labor. Ready for the next slide? Well, what was the effects on the Knights of Labor? It provoked widespread revulsion. Powderly could never separate the anarchist picture from the public mind, although he clung to his membership. When he finally gave it up by 1893, the union was pretty much dissolved. Now, why then did we talk about the Knights of Labor? Ready for the next slide? Well, the Knights of Labor did have some achievements. For example, underneath their pressure, the Federal Bureau of Labor and Statistics was created. The Foreign Act of 1885 penalized employers who imported contract labor. But most importantly, the Knights of Labor spread knowledge of labor unions and displayed how labor unions could be effectively organized. Ready for the next slide? That's it.